Hi, I'm Oliver Ilott. I'm a senior researcher at the Institute for Government. So a lot of people have been saying, why do we even have a Department for International Trade at the moment? It's true that we can't sign free trade agreements until we've left the EU. That seems to be at least 2 years away. So what's the point of having a Department for International Trade? When actually there's quite a lot for the department to do in the next 2 years, whilst those negotiations are going on. In the first instance, the department, frankly, just needs to build itself as an organization. So it's still in the process of hiring people. Now, there's this truism kicking around, the idea that the Department for International Trade needs an army of trade negotiators. Actually, that's quite misleading. I think it doesn't need an army. It's looking to have about 350 people. That's a relatively small number, but it's roughly where other countries are. The US trade representative is about 252. So it's not an army of people. It's a relatively small number. Nor are trade negotiators some kind of mythical creature, you know. They are not unicorns. Trade negotiators are people who understand their policy area. Often that's quite sector specific, so they might understand farming or intellectual property. And they're people who are used to negotiating. And actually we have people with those skills in Whitehall, and we can train them on specific trade aspects. So the Army of Trade Negotiators thing doesn't really hold water for me. So that's the first task for DIT, is to build itself. The second task for DIT is to establish the UK's position at the World Trade Organization. And we're a member of the World Trade Organization, but we don't have our own schedules. It's a little bit like having car insurance but being on your partner's policy. We'll need to establish our own schedules. And that is an instance in which, a couple of weeks ago, Liam Fox said that, well, we would do the sensible thing, which is copy across the existing European schedules that we have been trading under. And the third task for the Department for International Trade in the next 2 years is to establish what the UK's trade strategy is going to be. What kind of free trade deals do we want to do, and who do we want to do them with? And on the question of who we want to do them with, there'll really be 3 ways of looking at the issue. The first is purely economic. Who do we get the most economic benefit from in doing a deal with? The second is competitive. Who have other people done deals with from? Are they getting an edge in markets that we aren't? And it may be that we want to do some deals because some of our competitors have already done deals in those places. And the third reason will be political. There'll be some trade agreements that we, the UK, want to do because it meets our foreign policy or our defence objectives. So those are the 3 main tasks for the Department for International Trade in the next 2 years. It's about building the department, establishing the UK's position at the WTO, and defining the UK's trade strategy going forward. So the EU will, there'll be Brexit consequences for the EU on its own international trade agenda. Putting aside for one moment the question of its relationship with the UK, Brexit means that the EU will revisit some items in its own trade strategy. So in the first instance, the EU will have to look at its own schedules at the World Trade Organization. Those schedules, the tariffs that the EU has established at the World Trade Organization, they're granted by everybody else on the basis that there are 28 member states. If there are going to be 27 member states, that might change the EU's position at the WTO. So we talk about the UK needing to negotiate at the WTO. Actually, the EU will also have to negotiate at the WTO. And then the EU will have to look at the free trade agreements that it's already done. So those free trade agreements will contain the words UK in their text. Where are they left? Probably that's a pragmatic issue that they can work through. Their partners will still want those deals to exist. But nevertheless, there's a problem for the EU here in terms of getting its own house in order following Brexit. Brexit leaves the residual EU with a couple of fairly legal but nevertheless important questions in terms of tidying up its own trade policy. And then finally, it's worth thinking about the influence that the UK has had on that trade policy and how the EU trade policy might change once the UK has left. And a great example here is trade defence policy. And those are tariffs that the EU applies to goods which it thinks are unfairly undermining its own domestic industries. And historically, the UK has tended to vote against trade defence measures. It's tended to view them simply as protectionist. And with the UK gone, it will be interesting to see whether the EU feels like it has a greater license to use trade defence measures in the future. And that's one example of how the UK's diminishing influence in Europe might change how Europe pursues trade policy in the future.